In the sun-drenched corridors of Miami University, where the scent of salt from the Atlantic mixes with the dry paper smell of old libraries, academia is a serious, often stressful pursuit. But in the philosophy department, a place dedicated to contemplation and the quiet dissection of human nature, violence was a purely theoretical concept. It was a place of discourse, not destruction. That all changed on September 19, 2018. The case that followed would not be a whodunit, but a deeply disturbing "why did he do it?", challenging the very foundations of the justice system, mental health, and the nature of evil itself. The story begins, as so many academic tragedies do, with a deadline. Gabriel Young was 27 years old. By all accounts, he was an intense but brilliant graduate student. He had dedicated the last 3 years of his life, and likely accrued staggering debt, to a single monolithic goal: his doctoral thesis in philosophy. His chosen subject was moral absolutism in an age of relativism, a dense, 3-for-7-page defense of universal ethical standards. His mentor, and the man who held the keys to his future, was Dr. Richard Sullivan, a 58-year-old philosopher widely respected for his demanding but fair approach to teaching. Dr. Sullivan had published 4 books, established himself as a leading voice in virtue ethics, and ironically dedicated his career to understanding the very foundations of ethical behavior. That afternoon, Gabriel Young had a scheduled meeting with Dr. Sullivan. It was the meeting to receive his final thesis evaluation. It did not go well. The evaluation, later recovered from Sullivan's computer, highlighted deep concerns about the foundational premises and methodological inconsistencies. The final grade, stamped on the blood-soaked papers found at the scene, was failing. Shortly after the meeting began at 3:17 p.m., multiple witnesses in the normally bustling hallway of the philosophy department reported hearing shouting from Dr. Sullivan's office. The shouting was followed by several loud, sickening thuds, and then an eerie, profound silence that settled over the corridor like a shroud. At 3:47 p.m., exactly 15 minutes later, a teaching assistant named Melissa Churn arrived to drop off student papers. She knocked on the door. A voice, calm and steady, called for her to enter. It was not Dr. Sullivan's voice. The horrified assistant found Gabriel Young, 27 years old, sitting quietly in the blood-spattered visitor's chair across from his professor's desk. Dr. Sullivan was on the floor, bludgeoned repeatedly until he stopped moving. Young was just waiting. He had made no attempt to clean the victim's blood from his own hands or clothing. The murder weapon was placed neatly on the desk between them. It was a heavy brass desk ornament, a replica of Rodin's The Thinker, which Dr. Sullivan had received as an award for academic excellence years earlier. Now, it was an instrument of slaughter. Young had used the very symbol of his professor's intellectual achievement to end his life. Melissa Chun fled, her voice trembling on the 911 recording. "Please help. There's been a murder. There's a student here. He says he did it. He's just sitting here with the body." Campus Security Officer Marcus Johnson was the first to arrive. His body camera footage, later shown in court, captured the surreal scene. Young offered no resistance. In fact, as Officer Johnson detained him, Young, still spattered in blood, even corrected the officer on proper restraint techniques when they initially applied the handcuffs incorrectly. Before any Miranda rights were read, before any formal questioning began, Young volunteered a full confession. "I killed Dr. Sullivan because he failed my thesis," Young stated clearly, his voice steady. "I used his award statue. It's on the desk if you need it for evidence." Officer Johnson, a 15-year veteran, would later describe it as the most chilling display of calm after violence I had ever witnessed. This was not a crime of passion. This was something else. Miami-Dade police arrived within 12 minutes. Detective Benjamin Price, a 20-year veteran, took lead on the case. He recalled his first impression of Young as unnervingly placid, like someone who had just completed a satisfying task rather than committed a brutal homicide. Young immediately informed Price that he had killed Dr. Sullivan, that he had no regrets, and that he was prepared to accept the full consequences. His demeanor was described as cooperative to the point of being eager to provide details. The crime scene itself told a story of explosive violence, followed by calculated composure. Blood spatter analysis indicated the initial attack was frenzied and powerful. Dr. Sullivan, likely looking down at Young's thesis when the first blow struck, was probably unconscious after the second or third blow, but the medical examiner would later determine there were 11 blows in total. The remaining impacts suggested a methodical finishing of the job, rather than an uncontrolled rage. After the murder, Young had carefully placed the murder weapon on the desk. He then used a tissue from Sullivan's desk to wipe his own fingerprints from the door handle. But, in a bizarre contradiction, he made no attempt to remove his prints from the bloody brass statue itself. He then positioned himself in the visitor's chair to await discovery. This peculiar blend of impulsive violence and meticulous, selective cleanup would become a central psychological puzzle. As Gabriel Young was processed at the Miami-Dade County Jail, he made a statement that would set the tone for the entire legal journey. "I want the maximum penalty possible," he told the booking officer. "Whatever will end this fastest." When given the opportunity to call an attorney, he refused, stating that he saw no point in defense when guilt is absolute. His mugshot, taken just hours after the murder, shows a young man with disheveled hair, wire-rimmed glasses slightly askew, and an expression of complete, utter emotional detachment. But who was the man he killed? Dr. Richard Sullivan was far more than a name on an incident report. He was a 58-year-old titan in his field, a man who had shaped ethical discourse for 3 decades. His office, now a sealed crime scene, had always been a sanctuary, lined with books and photos of former students. He had recently been awarded a grant to study moral reasoning under conditions of extreme stress. His colleagues described him as a man who fundamentally believed in the capacity for human reason to overcome our baser instincts. He left behind a wife of 32 years, Dr. Catherine Sullivan, a pediatric surgeon, and 2 adult children. Catherine Sullivan would later testify that her husband had mentioned Young as increasingly concerning behavior in the months before the murder, but he had expressed worry rather than fear. Richard saw it as his responsibility to help Gabriel find perspective. She told the court, her voice breaking. He believed that with the right guidance, Gabriel could channel his intellectual intensity in healthier directions. This portrait of the victim only deepened the mystery of the killer. Sullivan wasn't a cruel tyrant. Recovered emails showed his continued commitment to Young, trying to balance rigorous academic standards with compassion. 5 days before his death, he had written to Young, "While I cannot in good conscience approve this thesis in its current form, I remain convinced of your intellectual capacity to address these fundamental issues." He offered detailed suggestions and additional mentoring. This was not academic cruelty. It was a professor attempting to maintain standards while also showing considerable patience. A stance that, maintained with integrity, ultimately cost him his life. The investigation into Gabriel Young's life unearthed a pressure cooker of obsession and paranoia. Later that evening, after obtaining a warrant, detectives searched Young's immaculately organized apartment. On his desk, they found a sealed envelope addressed to investigating authorities. Inside was a typed, signed, 3-page statement, dated the day before the murder. In it, Young methodically outlined his intention to kill Dr. Sullivan if his thesis was rejected, claiming the rejection justified his response. This discovery was the case breaker. It transformed the crime from a possible impulsive act of rage to a cold, calculated, premeditated murder. But the digital evidence was even more chilling. Detectives seized his university laptop. It contained an obsessively organized research database for his thesis. And inside that, a folder labeled Responses to Rejection, created 3 months before the murder. This folder contained notes on historical figures who had faced professional rejection, and most disturbingly, extensive research on other cases where students had attacked professors, complete with Young's analytical notes assessing the effectiveness of various approaches. He hadn't just snapped. He had studied. He had researched premeditated murder through a distorted academic lens. His journal documented his escalating paranoia. Sullivan doesn't recognize the revolutionary nature of my work because it threatens the comfortable orthodoxy he has built his career upon, he wrote 6 weeks prior. If he rejects my thesis, he's attempting to erase years of my life and thought. The final entry, the night before, was simple. Tomorrow, judgment comes. Either mine or his. Financial records revealed another layer of pressure. Student loan debt exceeding $200,000, depleted savings, maxed out credit cards. His lease was expiring. Sullivan's rejection wasn't just an intellectual setback. It was the complete collapse of Young's precarious life structure. The interrogation at police headquarters was unlike any Detective Price had ever conducted. Young waived his Miranda rights with a disturbing eagerness. Price, concerned about competency, had a forensic psychiatrist, Dr. Rebecca Chern, observe the interview. Young sat perfectly still, maintaining direct eye contact, and confessed as if presenting a paper. I killed Dr. Richard Sullivan because he failed my doctoral thesis, he stated for the record. I used his award statue. I had decided the previous day that if he rejected my work, I would kill him, and I carried out that decision as planned. When Price asked if he was angry, Young corrected him. Anger isn't the correct categorization. I experienced a rational recognition that Sullivan had effectively destroyed years of my intellectual work. My response was proportionate to that destruction. Price pushed him on the 11 blows. Why continue hitting him? Young's answer was the nexus of his pathology, because incomplete actions create cognitive dissonance. Once I decided to kill him, I needed to ensure the action was completed thoroughly. Partial completion would have been intellectually unsatisfying. He then launched into a 40-minute explanation of his thesis, his voice filled with pride. He framed Sullivan as intellectually dishonest, a gatekeeper suppressing revolutionary ideas. The most chilling moment came when Price asked why he stayed at the scene. Escaping would defeat the purpose, Young explained. This was about establishing a direct correspondence between action and consequence. He stated he had no reason to hide what he viewed as a philosophically justified act. If my thesis on moral absolutism is correct, then my action was morally permissible. When his court-appointed attorney, David Cohen, finally arrived and demanded he stop talking, Young firmly refused. I'm fully aware of the consequences, he told his lawyer. That's precisely why I'm being cooperative. He then volunteered, unprompted. I considered multiple methods but selected the statue because of its symbolic significance. His final statement to Price before being returned to his cell, where he would be placed on psychiatric observation, was a summary of his entire worldview. I'm not remorseful. Under the same circumstances, I would make the same decision again. His rejection of my work represented an intellectual violence that justified a physical response. I expect the state to now exercise its legitimate power to punish me accordingly. The trial of the state of Florida vs. Gabriel Young began on February 4, 2019. The courtroom was packed. Judge Raymond Martinez presided. The prosecution, led by Victoria Cooper, had a mountain of irrefutable evidence. The defense, led by David Cohen, had an impossible client. Cohen had tried to pursue an insanity defense, but multiple evaluations found Young legally competent. He understood the proceedings and knew right from wrong by societal standards. He simply rejected those standards in favor of his own. The trial began with a moment of pure legal drama. As Cohen rose for his opening statement, he announced, "Your Honor, my client instructs me to waive opening statements and enter a guilty plea to all charges." A gasp filled the courtroom. Judge Martinez addressed Young directly, warning him that a guilty plea to first-degree murder carried a sentence of life without parole or death. Young's response stunned the court into silence. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand completely, and I specifically request that the court impose the death penalty as the appropriate punishment for my crime." Judge Martinez immediately called a recess. In chambers, a bizarre legal battle unfolded. Cohen, the defense attorney, argued against his client's plea, stating Young was actively seeking execution by the state and manipulating the system towards suicide by court. Cooper, the prosecutor, found herself in the strange position of agreeing with the defense that a full trial was necessary. Judge Martinez ruled that the case would proceed to trial, citing the court's independent obligation to ensure justice is properly served in capital cases, regardless of the defendant's stated preferences. When court reconvened, Young was visibly frustrated, accusing the court of procedural obstruction of justice and denying him his right to take responsibility. The trial that followed was a surreal spectacle. As the prosecution presented its flawless case, the 911 call, the body cam footage, the blood spatter analysis, Young sat at the defense table, taking meticulous notes. He would occasionally pass these notes to his horrified attorney, not to suggest a defense, but to offer corrections or clarifications about details of the evidence, effectively helping the prosecution strengthen its case against him. The key testimony came from Dr. Thomas Reynolds, an independent philosopher from Columbia University, brought in to analyze Young's thesis. Reynolds explained to the jury how the thesis document itself was a map of Young's psychological deterioration. The early chapters present conventional academic arguments, Reynolds testified, but around page 187, the work begins constructing a philosophical justification for responding to intellectual violence with physical force. It's academically dressed vengeance theory. He concluded that Young had created a profound warping of philosophical reasoning to serve deeply disturbed personal needs. Throughout this, Young nodded in apparent agreement, seemingly proud of the analysis. The defense's only traction came from Young's undergraduate advisor, who testified that the Gabriel she knew was brilliant, collegial and responsive to feedback, painting a picture of a profound psychological collapse that occurred during his doctoral studies. She described doctoral programs as psychological pressure cookers where rejection can be experienced as existential annihilation. Then, against his attorney's strongest objections, Gabriel Young took the stand. Calmly, as if in a seminar, he confessed again. I recognized that he was effectively negating years of my intellectual labor. I determined that a proportionate physical response was justified. On cross-examination, Cooper asked, "Mr. Young, did you understand that killing Dr. Sullivan was illegal?" "Of course," he replied. "I fully understood that society prohibits killing. I simply concluded that society as prohibition was outweighed by the moral imperative to respond proportionately to the destruction of my life as work." After just 4 hours, the jury returned. The verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. Young's reaction was not distress. It was a slight nod, as if receiving confirmation of an expected academic evaluation. The penalty phase began. The prosecution argued for death, citing the aggravating factors: premeditation, cruelty, and his total lack of remorse. Catherine Sullivan gave a heartbreaking victim impact statement. "The cruel irony," she wept, "is that he was killed for maintaining academic standards, a wound that will never fully heal." David Cohen, in his final plea for Young's life, argued against what his client wanted. "We must ask whether the state should facilitate what amounts to suicide for a deeply disturbed individual. Justice is not served by fulfilling the defendant's disturbed wishes." Finally, Young was allowed to address the jury himself. "I do not seek mercy or mitigation," he stated, standing at the podium. "I made a deliberate decision. I now accept the logical consequence, my own death. There is a philosophical symmetry to this outcome that I find appropriate. I explicitly request that you recommend the death penalty." The jury was torn. They deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days. They returned with a split recommendation, 9-3 in favor of death. On March 15, 2019, Judge Raymond Martinez announced the final sentence. He acknowledged the profound ethical challenge of the case, but based on the statutory aggravating factors, the premeditation and the cruelty, not the defendant's wishes, he sentenced Gabriel Young to death by lethal injection. Young's reaction provided the final, disturbing spectacle. He showed visible satisfaction. He looked at the judge and said, "Thank you, Your Honor, for your procedural correctness. This outcome represents the appropriate application of proportionate justice for my actions." In the aftermath, Miami University implemented the Sullivan Protocol to identify students in psychological distress. Dr. Catherine Sullivan established a foundation for academic ethics and mental health, and Gabriel Young from death row continued his work. While his automatic appeals, which he fought, moved through the courts, he wrote a book manuscript. In 2022, a small press published it, Philosophical Justifications for Violence, a Defense from Death Row. The case of Gabriel Young remains a chilling study, not of a man who lost his mind, but of a man who used his mind to justify the unjustifiable, who twisted logic into a weapon, and who, in the end, viewed his own execution not as a punishment, but as the final, elegant validation of his life's work.